And joining us now, David Jacobson, the 22nd American Ambassador to Canada, and it's good to finally have you in that chair.
Steve, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. You and I met probably a year and a half ago or so, and we've been trying to get you there for a long time, so I'm glad it's happened.
We've been working hard, and we finally made it happen.
Okay. Since this is your first ambassador, since this is your first visit as ambassador to our studio, even though you've been in action for 2 years, let's start by finding out more about you. Had you been to Canada before?
I had. In fact, my first trip out of the United States in my life was when I was 7 years old. I came to Canada and ironically came here across the Ambassador Bridge.
There you go.
And if that kid had thought at the time that someday he'd show up here as the ambassador to Canada, he would have thought you were crazy.
The conventional wisdom is, though, when you get a choice of what position you want London, you want Paris, you want Rome, you want something fancier than Ottawa. So which was your first pick?
Ottawa.
And that's where I say, really?
Yeah, really. You know, it is, I talked to several people, both in the government, people who had been ambassadors before, people who had had different jobs, and I heard over and over and over again the same thing. This is the best job in the United States government. And in fact, when the next guy asks me, where should he go, I'm going to tell him Ottawa, because it is the best job in the United States government.
It is not the best city in the world, though. I think I can say that on solid ground.
It may not be the best city in the world, and it is kind of a one-horse town, but fortunately, I'm riding the right horse, so it's worked out well.
Okay. You are not, we can say, a career Foreign Service official.
I am not a career diplomat, and it should be obvious before we're done here today.
Well, so I mean, some people will be curious about how you got your job. You know Barack Obama.
I do. I've known the president since he was a young state senator in Illinois. We had a mutual friend who introduced us. I was involved in his Senate campaign somewhat, and I was very involved in his presidential campaign, and then I went to work with him in the White House, and I was fortunate enough for him to ask me to come to Canada as the United States ambassador.
And he actually did. He sat you down one day and he said,
David,
I got some ideas for you. What do you got?
Well, and I had actually, this is what I wanted to do, and this is what I asked to do, and he was gracious enough to say, okay.
There are not many people who can start a blog post with, having just come from the Oval Office with the American President and the Canadian Prime Minister, ... But you did the other day, and I read it, and it does prompt a question: how much FaceTime does the American ambassador actually get with the president?
Well, you know, the president's a busy guy. He's got like a whole world to worry about. And so it's a little harder to spend time with the president today than it was back when I first met him, when you could have gone to lunch with the president if you paid for the lunch. But you know, I get a chance to talk to him when I need to talk to him, and I spent some time with him on, I guess it was Wednesday when we were there. He's looking good. He sounds good. He's got a little bit more gray hair than he did when I first met him, but
a lot more gray hair.
Well, I covet that gray hair, so it's not so bad. It could be worse.
Some hair is better than no hair.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I will say this: when you sit there with him, and particularly in a group, and you listen to him not just talk about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada, but the world. We talked about the Middle East. We talked about the financial crisis in Europe. And he is so gifted in his ability to understand, to explain, to discuss, to listen. And it's just always a thrill to be there. You know, I worked in the White House, and I have spent time before in the Oval Office, but every time you go in there, it is just a thrill. The President and the Prime Minister were there sitting under the Emancipation Proclamation.
The original.
The signed A. Lincoln. And you know, it's just a special place, and you think about all the amazing things that have happened in that room, and just to be there and to be a part of it, and to be a part of it in this really important relationship it's just a thrill.
Well, let's talk for a little bit about whether or not you think Barack Obama is going to get to stay in that room for another 4 years, because unemployment is higher than he wants it to be, and the deficit is higher than he wants it to be, and Obamacare is not as popular as he wants it to be, and it might not even be constitutional at that. Does his re-election look increasingly unlikely to you?
Well, actually, I think over the last couple of months, it's probably looked a little bit more likely. But before I get into U.S. politics, let me say one thing, which I take very seriously. Whatever I used to be, and believe me, I used to be quite partisan. I'm here, I'm the ambassador for all the American people. I'm the ambassador for Republicans. I'm ambassador for Democrats. I'm the ambassador for Michelle Bachmann. I'm the whole gamut. But obviously, I follow domestic politics in the United States closely. I think this thing is going to turn on what is the narrative in the campaign, as most elections do. And if the narrative is how have things been in the last 4 years, all the things that you just point out, jobs, the economy, the deficit, those are tough. It's tough to run when there's 9% unemployment. If, on the other hand, the narrative is who's going to do a better job over the next 4 years, who is going to provide the best path to get us out of where we are, then I think the president's going to do a lot better. And I think you're going to see a lot of back and forth between the two parties to try to define the narrative in one direction or another.
There is a school of thought that says it doesn't really matter which of the Republican presidential candidates he goes up against because it's a referendum on him, and therefore it doesn't matter. Are you of that view?
It is a choice, and it will be a choice. You know, the president is fond of saying that right now he's kind of being compared to God Almighty, and by that standard, you know, he doesn't look so good. But there's going to come a time when he's going to be compared to their guy, whoever that is. And maybe he'll look a little bit better by that comparison. And so I think it does matter. You know, the current polls would seem to indicate that Romney's the stronger candidate, but then again, the polls a few months ago left as one of my former colleagues in the campaign said, Newt Gingrich is dead in the checkout line at Tiffany's. So
not anymore.
It's no. So, you know, things can change. I do think this, that in any presidential election, whatever happens during the course of the primaries, parties tend to gather back together and to cluster around their leader in a presidential election. And so whoever the Republican nominee is, whether it's Gingrich or whether it's Romney or whether it's somebody else, I think they'll be united. This will be a close election. It's going to be a tough election. But my hope is, more than anything else, obviously I want the president to be reelected. I'm his guy. But my hope is that at the end of the process that my country can come back together a little bit and we can start moving forward.
Our 18th Prime Minister, a guy named Brian Mulroney, always used to say, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative.
And that's very much the case.
Yeah. Which alternative do you think the president prefers to run against?
Well, you know, it's very much a shifting situation. You know, as I said, Romney seems to do better in the head-to-head polls than Gingrich does at the moment, but you know, only time will tell. As he said, he's going to wait until they vote the last guy off the island, and then he'll start worrying about it.
Has his presidency been as successful as he had hoped?
In some ways, it's been very successful. I mean, on the foreign policy side, what's happened in Iraq, what's happened in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, what we just saw in Libya, I think there's been an enormous amount of success on that front. And there have been some great domestic successes, most notably healthcare. You point out some aren't as happy with it as others, but the fact that for 100 years, there was some sort of public system of ensuring that there was uniform access to health care in the United States, and we failed for 100 years, and he was able to do that. That's a big deal. There have been some problems. There is extraordinary partisanship that's going on now. And the thing that I find hopeful is that this is not the first time that this has ever happened in the United States. We've had this several times before. I oftentimes talk about a book I read not too long ago called Freedom from Fear by a historian from Stanford named David Kennedy. And it talks about the Roosevelt years in the White House. And the first part of it's about the Depression, and you could use a word processor, Steve, and change Franklin Roosevelt to Barack Obama and 1935 to 2009, and you've got the same book and the same issues and the same gridlock and the same politics. And we overcame it, and we overcame it then, and we're going to overcome it now.
One of the reasons we, of course, wanted to get you here is that You and the President and the Prime Minister made some news this past week.
Well, they made the news. I just watched.
Okay, you just watched. The border deal. Let's, if we can, Michael, bring up this chart here, which shows some of the highlights of the border deal, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Here it is. There are sort of two tracks of this, two action plans. The first dealing with streamlining the continent's security system, starting with a heightened scrutiny of foreign travelers before they even enter Canada or the United States. There'll also be a new entry-exit system where both countries will share information on every border crossing in either direction. There will be joint screening of cargo entering the continent, so it only needs to be checked once rather than by both countries separately. Certain companies will be given so-called trusted status so they can move goods across the border more quickly. And there'll be teams of U.S. and Canadian law enforcement officials that will work together and operate on both sides of the border. Now, the second part of the action plan has to do with harmonizing regulations to cut down on red tape between the two countries. 29 initiatives in total. They'll look at harmonizing regulations in areas such as food and agriculture, transportation, health products, the environment, and a Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council will oversee the changes in these regulations. In a nutshell, why is this a good deal?
Well, I think that first of all, it is going to make North America, Canada, and the United States more competitive in a global economy. It is going to reduce barriers to trade. It is going to make it easier for people, good people and well-intentioned people to move back and forth across the border. It's going to reduce red tape. It is going to eliminate or reduce the tyranny of small differences. You know, I oftentimes talk about the fact that, pathetic as I am, I have the same thing for breakfast every morning, Cheerios. And they are fortified. They are fortified when I eat them in the United States with a different recipe than is required in Canada. And that just doesn't make any sense. What we've got to do is eliminate some of these differences. Deodorant is different in our two countries. Automobile parts are different. And so we want to reduce that. But on the border side, what we have come to realize is that the border itself is perhaps the worst place to make decisions about whether people or goods go back and forth across. And so what we're trying to do is get the information as far ahead of time as we possibly can, sometimes as far out as the perimeter of North America and beyond, but certainly before we get to the border. And if we do that and we do it smart, not only are we going to make it easier for people and goods to move back and forth across the border, but we are going to be safer because we're going to be able to devote the limited resources that both countries have at the border away from doing dumb things and checking people and goods that we should know better about, and be able to spend our time on the people and the goods that we don't know anything about.
Can I ask you about your Cheerios box?
Absolutely.
There are, in this country, there's got to be French on that Cheerios box. And my hunch is in the United States, there are some parts where there's Spanish on it. How are you going to work all that out?
Well, and that's a perfect point, Steve. That there are some things that are different in our regulation that ought to be different. For example, you use a metric system, we use an English system. You have labels that are in French, we have labels that are only in English. Those are not things we're talking about changing. What we're talking about is, for example, there was a piece in the paper today that when you buy Campbell's soup, in Canada, the cans are bigger than the cans in the United States because Canada requires a certain size can, and in the United States we don't have a requirement. Well, that may not be the most sensible thing in the world. With respect to pharmaceuticals, with respect to food products, we label meats with different names. Well, that's an added cost. It's a burden to trade across the border. And nobody in the United States is telling anybody in Canada that they have to make any regulation conform, or vice versa. But what we want to do is have smart, well-intentioned people sit down, discuss these things, and decide that it's in the best interest of the people on both sides of the border to coordinate these efforts.
Here's a clip from a guy you know pretty well. Watch the monitor over my shoulder. Michael, if you would, roll tape.
And the Prime Minister and I are determined not just to sustain this trade, but to expand it, to grow it even faster. So we're creating even more jobs and more opportunity for our people. Canada is key to achieving my goal of doubling American exports and putting folks back to work. And the two important initiatives that we agreed to today will help us do just that.
On the one hand, we hear the 44th president say that, but then on the other hand, we hear things like Congress wants to put in a Buy American provision and Canada will be excluded you know, and then they do their thing, and then diplomacy does its thing, and so on. Which America do we listen to up here?
Well, the president believes in free trade. I believe in free trade. There isn't any Buy America provision that is currently precluding anything from Canada into the United States. It was a piece of a bill that was introduced which has not passed, the American Jobs Act. The president would like to see passed. But as I said at the time, that was an effort to do the single thing that is the most beneficial to Canada that the United States can do, and that is get our economy going again. And one of the things that you learn when you spend some time in the political process, particularly in my country, is that legislation doesn't always contain every single thing that you want. Sometimes you have to put things in it to get it passed or to try to get it passed. And I think this was an example of that.